Bob, for that introduction, and thank you for having me. It's already been an interesting experience. I didn't know very much about this institute, and we've had a nice little workshop this afternoon where I've been able to get in contact with some of the researchers and talk about issues that are of concern for you, and many of which are of concern for me. That's a pretty ambitious title, New Frontiers in Research, and a frontier, I guess, has to do with where your perspective, where you're observing it from. So I should say just a couple of words about myself and where I'm coming from. I'm actually a social anthropologist who got drawn into the energy research world about 30 years ago, so we've met at least 3 times, once a decade. And at a time when there wasn't much social science of energy. It was mainly technical and physical, with a few economists in the game. And since that time, I've worked the entire spectrum from out in the field working with energy consultants, trying to talk to households about how they use energy and how they can conserve, up to more academic theoretical discussions of how we can put all this together and bring these perspectives together that you've been discussing. Because this is a field that absolutely demands interdisciplinarity. We're not going to get anywhere unless we can begin to communicate with each other across these social, technical, and individual, if you will, boundaries. And one of the things that's taken up much of the last decade of my career has been working on how to promote interdisciplinarity. I could have lectured about that for 45 minutes tonight, but it probably wouldn't have been very interesting. It's a challenge when we're all operating in different vocabularies and from different conceptualizations of the world. How are we going to communicate and move these frontiers of research, given the enormously urgent need to have a more robust theory of energy consumption given the demands of climate change? And as I'm going to get into today, I think we have known that we're going to need to adjust our theory for probably 25 or 30 years now, and not much has happened. And an interesting question is why? Why can't we seem to get over many of the reductionisms and the disciplinary reductionisms that have been involved in energy research and be more interdisciplinary and understand that we have to focus on the interactions between the material, the technical, and the social? Why can't we move there? And something that's been encouraging for me over the last decade is that after a very flat development, I think, over the first 20 years that I just mentioned, that there are some things beginning to happen. There are some new ways of thinking about energy consumption that are beginning to have a purchase in policy discussions. Organizations, very conservative organizations like the International Energy Agency are inviting discussions about social practices. We would have thought of that 10 years ago. So at least there is an interest there, and I think for many of you in this room who work with consumption, I realize you work with many different aspects of energy use, both production and consumption. So I hope that the insights I come with today will be interesting and applicable to different contexts than energy consumption. But the door is opening a bit, and I think we in the energy world have to move in and try to do something about it. So I am going to give a bit of a resume. Now, 45 minutes is a very short period of time. I'm going to try to give a resume from my perspective of where some of the weaknesses have been in the ways that we theorize energy consumption, and where the new envelope is moving in terms of encompassing a more robust theory. These are what I call some of the reductionisms that we have seen in the world of energy consumption, research, and theory. The social world that we live in, the context of everyday life, the things that we do and that we can consume, that consume energy, are reduced to individual agency, rational sovereign individuals who are fully agentive in changing their everyday lives and changing the world if they're just given the right amount of information and the right amount of marketing in this kind of way. So the social world is reduced to a sum of all of the individuals in the society, sometimes called methodological individualism. That has been one of the characteristics that has been in place ever since the beginning of the energy crisis in 1970. Often in our field, the material world, I mean, there's a lot of focus on technology and materials, but it's most often related to efficiency, technical efficiency and economic efficiency. That is the form for reductionism that is preventing us from looking at the fuller, more robust ways that complex technologies structure and influence our everyday lives. And that needs to be brought to the table. The knowledge people bring to bear in consumption is reduced to reflexivity and cognition, and further to economic rationality and deductive reasoning. So we have an imagined consumer who is thinking in a certain rational way, is reflexive throughout his or her entire day about all the choices that he or she makes in terms of energy, weighing the various costs and benefits. And we know from our own, looking at our own lives, our own personal biographies, that that's simply untrue. So that's another form for reductionism that we have to get around. There are other forms for knowledge that are brought to bear in energy consumption decisions. We were talking about this today in the workshop, and I want to go back and say a few words about that. And lastly, and here I'm kind of skating out into an area that is more difficult politically, household consumption has been segregated from the broader political economy of consumption that we all live in. And you could call it a political reductionism. Essentially what we're saying is that we want people to use less in a society that's encouraging more in virtually every way you can imagine, and associating more with well-being, with progress, and with prosperity. Is it possible to make a challenge of that from inside the energy sustainability world? I'm not sure, but I think some more of us have to be talking about it. So I want to say a few words about that. So basically here is a summary of some of the points. We need to reinvest consumption, very simple statement, sounds simple. Reinvest consumption with the contributions of sociality, materiality, and historically experienced or deposited knowledge, both collective and individual. We live in societies, we live in places, we live in national contexts, we live in neighborhoods that have histories. And living in those contexts deposits a kind of an experiential knowledge, a practical knowledge about how we go about doing things. That knowledge is brought to bear very often in the ways that we use energy, and we need to be able to get a grasp on that if we're going to understand how to transform energy consumption. So there's a need to theorize the synergies between the collective, or you could call it the political economic imperative, to expand consumption and expanding consumption practices in the home. What are the relationships there? The level of relationships, right? How are households, neighborhoods, and communities and cities nested in a political economy of consumption going to be able to reduce their energy consumption? Come back and maybe get some discussion of that in the end. So let's begin with the social aspects of it. Now, I would say that in my view of the sort of landscape of energy research, this is one of the issues that has been brought to the table more than others, beyond the individual perspective, that people use energy consumption in order to create a certain social identity, in order to get ahead, in order to make themselves out to be a good parent, or a good father, or a good householder, or whatever. And this can be traced back, and again, I didn't mention it earlier, but what I found in my research I'm doing for a book now, where I'm going to be writing about some of the things I'm talking about here, is that, very interestingly, the social science prior to the 1980s was very interested in these kinds of dynamics between social structures and individual agency. The the ideas of understanding the kinds of practical knowledge that developed that I was talking about earlier, and in the sort of social instrumental ways that people use consumption in order to say something about themselves. Now, a lot of this in the period from 1980s, starting in the 1980s, going on for a couple of decades, I think, entered into what we call in social science the sort of postmodernist era. I don't know if you're familiar with that terminology, where we began to believe that social structures, social relations didn't matter much anymore, that to understand the world that was so fragmented, we had to get away from looking at social conventions and social norms. We had to focus on individuals and their own stories and try to develop a theory based on that. And what's happened from about 2000, over the last 15 years to today, is that there, in a number of domains, social science, energy social science, is reaching back to some of those earlier threads that got abbreviated in this so-called postmodern term, which was also allied with the neoclassical economic term, which itself is also interested in methodological individualism, and are beginning to reach back and develop these threads further. Social practice theory, network theory, a lot of the new theories, transition theory, can be traced back to the roots of these theories, can be traced back as far as the early 20th century. And Torstein Veblen was one of them, who came up with this idea of people using consumption. He was mainly focused on clothes, that people dressed in ways that were beyond their means in order to signal that they were actually higher in the social pyramid than they really were. Pierre Bourdieu developed this a bit further with his ideas about distinction. He defined the social world as a matrix. It was more complicated than linear, one-way, going up the pecking order. That in modern middle classes, people have different identities that they try to satisfy. If they want to be a good, they want to be a good father, a good parent, a good sporty person. That they want to represent through their consumption the appropriate kind of car or the appropriate kind of clothing for the job that you have, and so on. So these kinds of social issues are very important to acknowledge. But I think Elizabeth Shove has done some very interesting work on showing that not only is getting ahead one of the social explanations for how people consume, but also keeping up. When conventions and norms develop around consumption, if you're not doing things in the ways that your neighbors are doing it, if you're not doing things the way your peers are doing it, there's a social risk involved with that. So the norms about how to set up your home, the lighting in your home, the heating in your home, and so on, how to design your bathroom and your kitchen and your food preparation apparatus, also has to do with social norms and conventions, inconspicuous consumption, not just conspicuous consumption. Lord Lutzenleiser and I tried to pick this up, both of these social sort of magnets for consumption in a concept that we call social loading. Using the metaphor of electricity loading or energy loading, that people will design their consumption or design their home in order to meet a social peak load. For example, on a winter evening, if you have your mother-in-law over for a visit, you have to have all the lights on, you have to have the heating up to a certain level, and you have to be able to show that you're a good son-in-law or daughter-in-law, right? And in Norway, this is very, very, very important. And we've written quite a lot about the Norwegian feeling of coziness, or you have to create a cozy environment in the home, and energy contributes to that coziness in many different ways. And if you don't do it, there's a huge risk, social risk that you take. I could give you many examples, but one is a woman who had her father living in a block apartment. His wife, the mother had died, and he was living by himself. And there's an apartment block, and you're driving up to it, and you can see in Norway, very important to have your lights on all the time to signal that there's life in the home and action in the home. Very little discipline about turning lights on and off, except his light was always off. And she actually went up and encouraged him, because he had a little desk lamp on and he didn't need anything more. But she encouraged him to start turning on his overhead light in order to show that his, to avoid the risk that his daughter wasn't taking care of him properly, type thing. So they're very subtle ways that these influence how, the social issues influence how lighting is designed and how people use heat. And those are the kinds of things that we need to begin to think about if we're going to have a more robust theory of consumption. In many ways, you can say that energy is a social good. Another aspect that we need to bring to the table is what I call material agency. And here we're back to interdisciplinarity. There are lots of intersecting points here between those who work with structure, those who work with technology design, those who design energy systems, and social scientists on how the interaction between technologies and people is where energy use takes place. And we've had a more passive view, usually where the people and the technologies have been in two separate boxes. So we focus on behavior, which is square around the person over here, and we focus on the technology, which is got a square around the technology over there, and we don't think about the interactions between them. The fact is that technologies bring with them, especially in material-dense lives like you see in London, technologies bring with them a kind of structure and a script, as some people call it, we're talking about today, for consumption. And of course, technologies are not deterministic. Everyone is not going to use them in the same ways. But technology structure and channel behaviors in certain ways that we need to bring to the understanding of consumption. And the famous statement by Heidegger, things have knowledge. They do have a form of knowledge. And that knowledge has to be brought to the energy consumption table. I don't think it's really there. It's recognized in archaeology. You really construct social worlds out of the ways that artifacts are distributed. It's recognized in material culture, where we're trying to find the sociobiographies of things as they progress through their own lifetimes. Arjuna is one of those who's written about that. It's recognized in the science of technology studies, which was sort of founded by Heidegger, where we have this idea of technology scripting, and we have to understand how the size, the shapes, and the embedded potentials in technologies that are placed there by the designer actually have an effect on the way that people use things. It's a little more difficult to see these sometimes in places like Great Britain, which have had materially dense lifestyle for several generations. But I've done research in other parts of the world, and one place is India, and there it's really interesting to see how the new modern household appliances coming in are having a very strong structuring effect on the ways that people use energy and on the ways that the whole social world is defined. One example, I don't know if any of you are researching refrigerators, but refrigeration is a very interesting subject. The refrigerators were actually, there was resistance to refrigerators when they were first introduced in the 50s and 60s in India. Why? Because there's a local cultural idea that cold foods and serving foods cold is bad for your body. It actually makes you stupid. And maybe something to that. If you look at our society today. Whereas a lot of the other appliances were coming in fairly rapidly, there was resistance to the refrigerator for various reasons, including these local health reasons. But as the social contexts around the household are changing in India, and women are going into the workforce to a greater degree and having less time at home, we have this time issue, which also affects everything that I'm talking about. We have to do things faster. The woman is still responsible for everything in the home, including all the food preparation. So then the refrigerator becomes very attractive. And then once the refrigerator is in the home with all of its scripts for all its potentials for consuming things differently than have been consumed before. Now you can cook food in quantity, and you can divide it up into bits, and you can put parts of it in the refrigerator, and you can warm it up tonight because you're coming home late. Convenience foods began to become popular, which were very unpopular at the time. If you look back up the chain to grocery stores, began to have a refrigerated section. You have warehouses, huge warehouses that are refrigerated. You have transportation that becomes refrigerated to deliver everything down the chain. And you have a disappearance of local markets, because the practices before were, you didn't need a refrigerator because you went out and did just down the block, bought the things that you needed. So an entire reconfiguration of the food system over just a couple of generations is happening because of refrigeration. So that's a very powerful intergenerational script. And you have some act much faster and some actually act more slowly. But refrigeration is one that once it is implanted, it's very difficult to imagine going away from it. The other one that also has to do with refrigerated air is the air conditioner. We also talked about it in the workshop today. I just want to go over to sort of one slide there. This is a representation. I've done quite a bit of research in Japan on air conditioning and energy use for air conditioning. These are 24-hour days. On the day of the year which had the highest peak load, where the peak electricity use during the day was the highest. And you see over the years how that peak is increasing. That's just a physical manifestation of air conditioning, basically. There were no air conditioners basically in Japan in 1960. By 1990, 100%, almost 100% air conditioning within a period of 30 years. And that has been the result. And of course, that's a very inefficient, from a lot of different ways, it's a very inefficient energy system that has to meet those peaks. You need the full, here's the base load and here's the peak load, and you need to dimension the system to meet that. And actually, especially after Fukushima, the nuclear accident, places like Tokyo having very difficulty meeting these peaks. And you may have heard about what's happened to other practices that have changed as a result now. The government started, while I was there in the 1990s, started encouraging Japanese businessmen not to wear ties 1 day a week. It was called casual day. And there was huge resistance in the beginning. How could you imagine conducting business without a business suit? Today, I went back to Tokyo last year in a conference. Almost no businessman wears a business suit anymore. It's actually been a result of the fact that all of these campaigns of how we can increase the temperatures a bit on peak days and encourage people to wear lighter clothing. So you have a whole system of different practices that are affecting one another that can all be traced back to the material agency in the new kinds of building materials and house designs that started coming in after 1960. This is not a case of some Japanese families and individuals who suddenly decided one day they were uncomfortable and went out and bought an air conditioner. No. It's a case where the entire landscape of housing structures and building techniques and building styles began to be built for air conditioning. And once again, you can almost use the word lock-in. Japan in 1960 had a wonderfully developed, what you could call indigenous agriculture, situated building architecture that was, Japan is a series of islands from north to south with very different microclimates on all the islands. It had buildings that were very well designed to tolerate the heat and microclimates. Most of that has disappeared in the years. I see the same thing happening in India, where I've done research more recently. You go to a university in India, it doesn't even teach anything about natural cooling techniques. It only teaches about how to build houses for air conditioning. All right, so these are the kinds of issues that need a perspective that recognizes material agency if we're going to understand how to deal with that. This is the other thing that I think's been missing and is being brought back, and I was very encouraged to see in some of the papers today we're talking about various aspects of this. Experiential knowledge, it's been called different things, tacit knowledge, practical knowledge, because in a lot of our assumptions about the way people use energy is that, in a sense, every decision is a recreation of all of the world. You know, it neglects the fact that there's history, that people have lived in the world, you know, since they were born, and their parents have taught them various things that we sometimes call culture and so on. And by living in a sociocultural space and growing up in it, you learn certain things. Deposits memory, and under certain conditions forms what Bourdieu called dispositions for new performances of the same action. So that in reality, we're not talking about reflexive sovereign individuals that are running around getting deductive information and making choices based on cost and benefit. The knowledge that is really brought to bear most often in most energy consumption decisions in the home are running on this tacit experiential knowledge. And that leads to habits. And again, this is a new renewal of interest in something that was quite important in social research, social science research in the early 20th century. Actually, this was understanding habits was the ultimate question for social science. How do collective memories, collective ideas, and individual actions get locked into certain routines? And how does that lead to action, and what does that mean for changing action, and these kinds of issues? Well, now I think it is being brought back, partly by Alan Ward and Dale Southerton, who held a long series of workshops on this at Manchester over a period of a few years. And now I think habits are coming back on the table, because I think this is one of the main, the neglect of habits, you know, is one of the main reasons why we're not making any progress in providing people with all of this information about climate change and all of these various urgencies about what we have to do to change. Habits are sticky. They're difficult to change. And we probably need a different kind of incentive structure and a different kind of information if we're going to get at habits. And that's one of the challenges. I think several of you are working there at this front. You know, what does that mean for the ways that we provide incentives, information, and carrots and sticks, if you will, for getting people to change their consumption behaviors? Because we have all of these examples. We've done several studies at the University of Oslo where we look at so-called green consumers, you know, the families that are either engaged in environmental movements or in some way can be defined as green. Then we look at the consumption compared to the average consumption of people in the same socioeconomic groups. Almost no difference. Very little. And part of the explanation for that is because we are involved in routines, and that doesn't mean I'm blaming individuals, because we're constrained also by the material rules in which we exist. You can't, you know, for example, naively keep working up the gasoline, petrol prices, and expect people to take a bus if there's no bus that comes by your house, right? I mean, there's all these things about the co-evolution of demand, the way the material and the individual have to mesh, and if we're going to make it easy for people to get out of these sticky habits, and this gets acknowledged in energy saving policies. So that's another domain that's very, very important to look at. The sociologist Max Weber, he's one of the big ones, and he said this somewhere around 1940 and 1950. And here we come to the political parts of it. The development paradigm from the mid-20th century, a model of the economy, society, and the subject that relentlessly promotes productivity increases, a fuel that keeps the machinery running, and a form of civilization that endows all its members with a biographical model that stipulates interminable self-transcendent growth. Isn't that the kind of model we live in? And now we're trying to tell people that within this growth model, we need to reduce the ways we consume energy. And that results in certain paradoxes and problems that I think we need to come to grips with if we're going to make any progress. And especially in a sense, what I'm writing in my book is that we're not only not dealing with habits, we're not dealing with the habits of expansion. We are habituated to expansion. How do we get out of that habituation? Both collective and personal biographies associate the sustaining improvement of well-being with growth, expansion. And capital, commodities, living spaces, comfort, convenience, tempo, geographies of everyday life, getting bigger, individual ownership. David Harvey, who some of you may know, he was written several critiques of sort of neoclassical economics and the kind of political economy it creates. That he wrote that life in growth societies has pervasive effects on ways of thought to the point where it has become incorporated into a common sense way many of us interpret, live in, and understand the world. Common sense. Growth is common sense. And that's another way, in the sense of saying it's habitual tacit. It's an idea that we just naturally assume will lead to a better life, lead to better well-being. And I don't know, I thought I just to give you a couple of examples of the material and economic manifestations of that. I mean, that's the world economy from 1900 per capita to, I think it's 2005 or so, up and to the right. And I guess Tim Jackson has calculated if we continue growing at the same rate, the economy will be 80 times bigger in 2100 than it is today. Is that feasible? I mean, you know, obviously not. And if you look at specifics, things that where space matters in the consumption of energy, that's the refrigerator. The typical refrigerator in 1970, and the typical refrigerator in 2012. Huge. It's another one of these things, inconspicuous kind of consumption things that if you have a smaller refrigerator, I mean, if you look into a new kitchen today, it's starting to have a huge space for the refrigerator. Can you imagine putting a little one in there and then inviting somebody over? That's pretty strange, right? You got to fit the refrigerator into space. And another thing that's been a pet peeve of mine also, you know, when we label cold appliances, you probably know that we label by volume class. So this one here could be an A and this could be a C, even though the total annual consumption of this was much less than this one. So it's another example of going over from an efficiency to a reduction model. These kinds of data, this is the average Norwegian house size from 1960 to 2000, where you can see that there was a tripling of the absolute, the top one is the house size. There's about a 1.5 growth in the absolute volume of the house, whereas there's been a tripling in the number of people per person. How can you have that? It's because fewer people are living in these gigantic houses, right? I don't know what the statistics are in Great Britain, but in a town like Oslo, a city like Oslo, which has a population of 500,000, 47% of all homes in Oslo only have one person living. Is that a sustainable society? Imagine the number of appliances per capita, the number of, the amount of heating per person, and on. So and we have the same trends in the United States. I think the OECD average is not too different from this. The number of rooms in the house is expanding. The number of bathrooms in the house is expanding. We're going from shared bedrooms for children to individual bedrooms for children. The average number of bathrooms in a U.S. home in 2010, 2.5. The 1/4 of all homes built in the U.S. in 2005 had 3 or more bathrooms. Think about that. And then there have been studies from the UK. Energy Savings Trust has done some very interesting studies, which have showed the expansion in the number of appliances, the expansion in the number of plugs people need, and so on and so on. So we're back to one of the frontiers of research, is trying to get a grasp on how we're going to deal with the culture of expansion. And I'm coming towards the end. So, first of all, conceptualizing and researching the contributions of and relationships between the social, material, and experiential context of everyday living. That's at the cutting edge. And I think there are several new initiatives and kinds of theories that are developing that try to encompass that. And I'm not going to go into the details of those, and some of you are working with various ones of these. We have social practice theory, as I said, which is basically encompasses the idea that we do when we have routine behaviors, that they can lead to practices, which in turn lead to habits, to which we have materials that contribute, as well as know-how, as well as deductive information about how we have to change. So that is a more systemic way of looking at consumption that I think has a lot of promise. We have transition theory, another one that very strong in Denmark, that's trying to conceptualize some of the same things. Active network theory is another one. All of these put emphasis on different things, and I think there's a potential for a sort of merging, fuzzing up of the boundaries between some of these. For example, I think active network theory doesn't quite put enough emphasis on know-how and tacit knowledge on one hand, whereas practice theory, social practice theory, doesn't have as good enough grasp on material agency, and maybe there's a way that merging those two ways of thinking about consumption could lead to something more interesting. Research on how habits form and change, and how can policy enable change. Those are two different but related things that need to happen. And I think a stronger analytical focus on absolute reduction of energy use. The reduction, the R word, I used to call it the R word, because you couldn't mention it in any context that had to do with national policy. We don't want R's, we want E's, we want efficiency, which is a way of saying that we will allow growth to continue indefinitely as long as we can deliver more efficient economies and more efficient technologies, that everything will work itself out. Of course, now, after 30 years, after the oil shocks of the 1970s, we have lots of empirical evidence that shows that that's simply not happening. We have managed to somewhat, in the OECD, getting close to civilization, but at very, very high levels, of course. And we simply can't go on with that. I like to tell, we have a course on this that I just finished at our university, where we go through the political ambition levels for reducing energy consumption from 1986 to today. You know, when our common future was produced in 1986, the Brundtland World Commission report on the environment, how much reduction did they say was necessary in the industrialized world in order to avoid severe climate change? 60%. By the Rio conference in 1992, that was reduced to a consensus around 15%, and then 10%. And then the U.S., George Bush, said no, the American lifestyle is not up for negotiation, because he understood that changing the way we use energy is going to go right into the household, inside the door, and into the way that people use energy. Then by the Kyoto Protocol, it was down to 8%, and now we're off in some diffuse world where I'm not sure what we think we need to reduce. So the R word needs to be brought more strongly to the fore, not only at a political level, but we have to understand those synergies, as I said before, about how that is affecting the way that people routinely use energy and how they consume in the home. And that's all.
a lot of ground you covered in 40 minutes. I was delighted to see political economy emerging. Your comments on refrigeration reminded me of something that my mother-in-law once said to me, which was, first of all, no, we couldn't buy vegetables in Canton and take them the 2.5-hour journey to Hong Kong and eat them there because they'd be stale by the time we got them. And the fact that while she lived in Hong Kong, she would go shopping 2 or 3 times a day into the local market, which was 250 yards away. So the way material structures the way we live. I just wanted to say that it seems to me that we often think of people as being consumers of the things that technology offers, but we sometimes overlook the role of people in producing the technology that then constrains the way we live our lives. That's something that's particularly clear in the construction industry and the built environment and how that gets produced and reproduced. But anyway, I think we'll have to come here to Michelle.
Yes, Michelle Shipman from Oslo Energy Institute. Just sort of touching on Bob's point actually about fridges. I mean, you make the very good point that in the UK, because we've had sort of industrialisation for a long period of time, it might be harder to sort of spot sort of the impact of changing materiality on everyday life. One of the nice things I think here is the number of reality TV shows that are, whether it's wife swapping or house swapping, or history programs going back in time. The recent one, Back in Time for Dinner, where a family went from the 1950s through to the 1990s, is quite interesting. And the woman in that made a comment about the fridge that I thought you'd be interested in, was that although she found that getting the fridge in the 1960s or 70s, I can't remember, sort of revolutionised her life in the kitchen, she also made the comment that now she wasn't having the daily chats with the shopkeepers down the street, so it was completely restructuring her everyday life and her social experiences by virtue of having this fridge.
It's interesting to see the research that's been done on the advertising of appliances in the 50s and 60s, who was mainly in focus, the housewife. And we see those being repeated in India. You can be the good housewife, the efficient housewife, the good one, who actually have these appliances. But Ruth Cowan and others have shown actually that not that time was saved, much time was saved. We've just added on different things that have to do with this sort of house of patriarchy that we live in. It's one way people have used. Yeah, no, it's interesting that, I mean, I didn't really get into the different forms of information that are going to be necessary in order to affect passive knowledge or situated knowledge or practical knowledge. But a lot of people are using Jean Love and her ideas about communities of practice, learning from peers, being exposed to demonstration projects in which people might have a smaller refrigerator, but, you know, I mean, their neighbor right down the street has a smaller refrigerator, but their lives are going on just fine. You know, they're eating it just as well. And actually learning from what I see, you know, a lot of what I've talked about today may be considered pessimistic, you know, and I think from a national political level, there's reason for pessimism, but at the local community level, maybe some of you are working on this, I think there are people getting together and deciding that they want to do things differently, and changing the dynamics of habits and changing materialities in ways that are less environmentally intrusive. And I think exposure, understanding of those dynamics, and exposure of other households and other normal middle-class neighborhoods to those kind of dynamics is another form for information that might have an effect, rather than saying, you know, writing a pamphlet saying life of the small refrigerator is great. Nobody's going to pay attention to that. But exposure to different ways of doing things, learning through what some people have theorized as apprenticeship, right? You actually take another household and you apprentice them to a different way of doing things. These can be very powerful kinds of learning techniques. Going back to the past and showing how we did it in the past, I don't know, I can see both sides of that. You know, I think there have been a lot of mistakes made, you know, in the environmental discourses about saying we have to go back to the past if we're going to resolve environmental issues. And so that they probably can be effective, but I think you have to be careful about the way they're formulated. This has to be the postmodern modern. I mean, this is, I think, a new way of being cool is by affecting the environment. That's recycling, using this and most of it.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. It was excellent. I agree that we've got to kind of get to the root of why have we forgotten so much since the 1970s? What happened during this period? And there's a lot of people writing about that. And I don't know if you know the McGilchrist book, Master is a Mystery.
No.
Because it has a very interesting take on that as well. And there's also The Romantic Economist, which Bob actually recommended to me, where it shows that we have had a balance of different ways of thinking about things. But sometime in the 70s or 80s, this positivist utilitarian model just suddenly took over and it obliterated all the other discussion for a while. And we've gone through this period of forgetting. I mean, most of what you're saying was being said in the 70s, and a lot of people warning about these things. It's not. One of the things that McGilchrist says, which concerns me about the kind of options that you're looking at, is that he's talking about sort of left brain and right brain way of thinking about things. And the left brain very much is in line with this kind of positivist utilitarian approach. One of the things about that way of thinking is that we think we can control the future. And this idea that we can change people's habits by some policy nudge or some kind of program, I think is really dangerous, actually. And I think it's dangerous because the fundamental point about this is not how do we reduce energy, but how do we get people to live a different kind of human life. So the question is really about what it means to be a human being in this situation. And if we keep on trying to manipulate this situation so we get some other aim, like reducing energy, I think we will fall into a worse situation than before. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I understand. That's an interesting philosophical debate. I have a colleague working with me on well-being and conceptualizations of well-being, and she sort of agrees with you. We need to make everyone intrinsic environmentalists in a sense first, and then we change the world afterwards. I don't really agree with that 100%.
It's not that. I think there's a trap about trying to control.
Yeah, control is also
which is it's not only that. It's also about. Sorry, am I talking?
No, this is fine. This is fine. The wonderful thing is that so many people want to come in and drink and catch up. Carry on.
Sorry, this kind of what I call solutionism, which is trying to put everything together and have this multidisciplinary team and all these other things, may itself, one, you'll never grasp the system, but two, it's missing a big opportunity, which is to actually ask a different kind of question.
I still think there's a lot of potential for this practical learning idea, and I think, whether we understand it or not, we are enabling and disabling practices by the ways that we do things today. So, for example, to be very concrete, I see a very huge change in the attitude to bicycling and bicycle commuting that's happening because we're building safe infrastructures for bicycling in many cities around Europe. It's growing enormously fast. It's even changing in the U.S. So this is a way that you can sort of take the material agency idea and use it. You're not really forcing people. You're not regulating it or anything else. You're enabling safe bicycling. And you have a city like Denmark, Copenhagen, where bicycling has been going on for generations, and 40% of all commuting in Copenhagen is by bicycle. So that's an example of the kind of thing that we can use this interface, this material human interface.
No, I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying that if there's a difference between a policy which is trying to get people to use more efficient fridges or reduce their use of fridges, and one which says actually we just need to stop. We need to think about creating more space for people, because I think part of this is the time. You mentioned time.
There's time and space that are involved.
Which are really.
We should continue over during our glass of wine.
Yes. Could you say who you are?
Eric Lewis from the National Audit Office.
Yes.
Maybe because I'm an auditor. I was just struck by the fact that there was very little reference to financial costs in what you said tonight. in a way, the Grant report, the Minister of Growth back in the 79 forecast, depleting oil reserves, you wouldn't have any more fossil fuel, it would all become very expensive. Of course, it didn't account for what subsequently happened. We had a whole debate on peak oil 10 years ago, 15 years ago. That seems to have gone west now. We've got people like TJ Houghton saying, fossil fuel prices are probably going to be, at least at the level, if not declining for the next 15, 20 years, And I didn't understand quite how you see prices, financial costs. I mean, we've had an entire kind of debate over the last 30 years about environmental tax reform, the idea that we can tax, environmental externalities. But I mean, that's not really happening. EU ETS is weak, ineffective. We're not actually building in any of those costs. So you see, what I don't understand about what you're saying is, do you think you can accomplish these changes in the absence of financial changes?
No, I don't. No, that has to be a part of it, but that's the part that's usually dominating the whole perspective.
Right.
And these other parts are left in the background.
Right.
We have lots and lots of examples and histories of economic politics that are only making micro changes. We need both.
Yeah.
I would say that the economy is subsumed by these social issues. It's part of these social issues, definitely. And
But
realigning the costs are going to be important.
if I could just pursue that for a moment, political governments are not very good at taking these long-term decisions about, increasing the percentage of carbon taxes. I mean, look at the debate in the EU at the moment about EU ETS and backloading. I mean, it's appalling, frankly. So, is it going to happen without that happening?
Yeah. That's why I say these things you're pointing to are reason for pessimism at the national political economic level. And then you only have to be out spending a lot of time in the U.S. now, because I'm a scholar at Wilhite, and I'm watching the discussions over there, political debates. It's horrible. We have several political candidates that are denying climate change. We have several others that are wondering about it. It's simply not an issue. It has come nowhere near filtering down to the levels that I'm talking about here, about how we're going to realign both economic policies and technology policies and infrastructure policies to accommodate the transformation that we need. It's very easy to get disillusioned in this process, but on the other hand, we can't. I mean, in a sense, sometimes I formulate it as a crisis in democracy. How does the democracy take on board the kind of transformation that we need from the perspective of climate change? That's a question I don't have an answer to.
But you see the European Commission as being possibly imposing agendas which transcend individual democracies, imposing agendas which are long-term. And in that sense, and indeed in the UK Climate Change Act, the creation of Climate Change Committee Future Carbon Budgets is an attempt to try and transcend individual parliamentary timescales.
That's right. But I think, again, I don't know if you're familiar with the transition movement, the small city movement, a lot of community level movements where these kinds of things are possible and people are thinking longer term. And I think we need to look at what's going on there and how people are rethinking their everyday lives and what's important and what's not. And things to learn from those dynamics. And there also, the internet is enabling a lot of communication about these issues. Collaborative consumption, recycling clothes, reusing things. There's a growing number of websites that are actually coming in touch with people who may be interested in making those kinds of changes. So maybe that, from the bottom up, could eventually affect national political agendas. I don't know. But right now it looks pretty bleak.
Craig Shreve from the Energy Saving Trust. I think, in terms of, from what you're saying about the infrastructure and the bus that is needed to take you so that you don't use your car, it seems that the narrative around individual action is a convenient one for, given in the context of the UK, the EU, where public spending is basically being reduced. It's a convenient narrative for people to take hold of that the choices. What do you see as the way forward? I take on board things like transition movement, things that are happening in Germany with community energy and so on and so forth, but really looking at the kinds of people who are able to become part of those movements in the context of kind of social pecking order. Where, I mean, is it just merely a case of these have to be these kind of absolute reductions in energy usage? Do you see that they just have to come from a political level and then filter down, or I mean, do you see the demand
Yeah,
coming
that's one of the
from people
frontiers
who are
that I'm
just
trying
actually
to put up here, is that we have to look at those dynamics and how they're happening. And I don't agree that it's individual. I mean, individuals are making those changes, but they're doing it in a social political context that's encouraging them. And I think those are where the biggest changes are happening the fastest, especially in these communities where people are very close. The changes are participatory. They're participating in rethinking know-how and about consumption, about the good life, and coming forward to something new. Those are the very interesting experiments. Now, could that be done on a broader scale? Back to democracy, I'm not, it's a difficulty. But I think there's lots to be learned from those situations. And we need to be doing more to understand what's happening.
So you will.
Ian Cooper. As others have said, I'm delighted to hear you talking about it. I think it's really timely. And I'm very struck by the similarities of this course you offer and the ones that Tim Jackson offer on material concerns or well-being or sustainable economy. In particular, I'm struck by the kinds of sociological concepts that you don't voice. You don't talk about vested interests. You don't talk vested interests. You don't talk about contested values. You don't talk about the asymmetrical distribution of power. When you do talk about change, it typically comes from bottom-up movements. Why this unwillingness to talk about politics with both a small and a large P, and the kinds of overarching structures that need to alter?
That's a good question, and I take that to heart. What I am trying to compensate for, with all respect for Tim Jackson, and I really think the book he's doing is fantastic. I think even more radical approaches that are questioning the whole fundamentals of capitalism. And my new book is entitled, Breaking the Habits of Capitalism. But in a sense, I'm trying to say, to point to the domains that need to be changed. The political domain needs to be changed. But many political ecologists are not bringing the discussion down to everyday lives. And that's what I'm trying to bring in here. I'm trying to say that even those framing changes are not enough. We need to be operating at all different levels. We need to be more robust in our understanding about what's happening down at the level of household if those framing changes are going to have an effect. And the second thing is, after 10 or 15 years of those kinds of discussions, I don't see much change happening at that level. So we have to look at other levers at the top. So we need to look at other levers. On the contrary, if you look, I'm doing a course called Emerging Economies at my institute now, looking at Vietnam, looking at India, looking at China. Their economies are actually taking on board more neoliberal economic capitalism.
But it's, in terms of granularity, you're only moving up from individualism to small collectives. And we don't live in small collectives, or at least our lives aren't governed at the political level in terms of small collectives.
I think that I'm at the level of neighborhood, community, village, and so on. And I agree in urban areas it's more difficult. We tend to go under the door and you don't know.
You should live in the UK where the neighbourhood and the local authority are almost entirely disempowered.
Well, it's interesting to have other perspectives because isn't the UK where the transition movement actually started?
Yes, but when you look at the constituents of the transition movement, so as one of the large parts was in transition Stoke Newington in Hackney, which was 5 or 10 years ago kind of like one of the lowest income boroughs of Hackney. But actually the members of that were of a certain class, shall we say. It's great that it's been transition town Brixton as well. You know, they've done really great things, and hopefully people can coalesce around those. But other people in certain kind of economic situations with certain jobs and lives cannot actually engage in forward to engage in some of those quests, which I think is quite interesting.
Okay, well, that's interesting to hear. There are also, another place that's very interesting and will give you optimism is Latin America, because there are a lot of, even at the national level, they have this concept of buen vivir, in Ecuador and Bolivia, which is to change the constitutions to focus on social development instead of economic development. There's a lot of eco-village kind of thing happening at the local level. Maybe it's hopeless here. I don't know.
I think it's easier to believe in participatory democracy if you come from a European country. It's much more difficult to believe if you live here.
Well, it's not that easy in Norway. But at least there are some openness to the fact that we do live in a collective society and that we do have synergies that need to be taken care of back in here.
Are there any more questions? Yes.
I'm Russell Hitchings, I'm in geography here at UCL. Thanks for your talk.
Speak up, sir.
Yeah, thanks very much. This is what I was saying first of all. So I wanted to ask your thoughts. I mean, I'm taking a slightly different tack here, but I wanted to ask your thoughts on some things that I'm struggling with, I suppose, at the same time. So one things I'm thinking about in terms of my work and what you were saying in your talk. So the first thing is about theory and how wedded we should be to particular theories in this area of work. So at the start of your talk, you argued for a robust theory of energy consumption, and then right at the end, you argued for, sounded like, quite an eclectic range of often quite conflicting theories being brought to bear. So how do you see the role of theory in this agenda of yours? And my other question, I suppose, was related to that, and that was, you may have answered this already, in terms of terminology. And you were quite keen on the word habit, but the data that you, or the storyline that you attached to habit was one that lots of other people would attach to the word, or the phrase social practice. So I was interested to know your position on why you pitched it as a discussion of habit rather than practice. So what's the difference between habit and practice, and what's the role of theory in this agenda?
There's no, to start with the second part, there's no clear distinction. Habits could be said to be those kinds of practices that have a stronger governance of practical knowledge or embedded knowledge. That's one way to look at it. Okay? And I mean, you have to look at every society and every culture and see which, because that differs obviously from place to place. And so it's a kind of what we call an ideal type. A habit is a construction. It's a way of trying to understand a certain pattern of doing things that I think we need to give attention to if we're going to come forward to a theory of consumption which takes on board this experiential knowledge and its effects on the way we do things. And back to the other point, I think I probably shouldn't have mentioned those classic theories at the end, because what I usually try to do is emphasize what I think needs to be brought to the table. And these maybe need to be put together: experiential knowledge, material knowledge, and historical knowledge, and so on, need to be brought together in ways that none of these theories are actually doing in a very good way. But I'm just saying that those are the things that we need to have as components of a new theory, because policy is grounded on some bits of theory, all of it, whether it's implicit or explicit. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we're going to get a robust policy change until we get a robust theoretical conceptualization of consumption, which draws attention to other levers for policies than do the current ones. And that's not a very good answer to a very difficult question. That's the way I would put it.
Perhaps we can take that upstairs as well. Refreshments. I'd like to take. Would you be prepared to take 2 more questions?
Sure.
So, yes.
Hi there. I'm Maureen from City University.
Yeah.
But basically, I want to ask you more about the eventually the new energy union program for the European Union. Are you familiar with it?
With the what?
Energy union program.
No, I'm not that familiar with that.
Well, basically what they want is a free electricity market between whole Europe.
Yeah.
This means that in the future the electricity will be more affordable for the UK citizens.
Mm.
So if the electricity is more cheap in the future, people will don't really care about the energy consumption in their houses if it's going to be even as cheap as today. Maybe policy is going to be more expensive, but what do you think about in the future if the electricity is more cheaper than now with the new policy, with the new energy union policy? Is it really going to change the behavior or just?
That's a difficult one because it has different dimensions to it. Making electricity cheaper will make it easier for people in lower socioeconomic situations to live a good life. But it will also make the middle classes and the elites who are using the most of the energy today probably put energy further into the background because energy is not very much in the foreground anyway in the way that we consume and conduct our everyday practices today. So essentially, in a way, it is embedding energy deeper into the tacit aspects and probably will make it less of a factor in the ways that we make decisions about how to consume. But those are very complex issues, and I think many energy researchers would argue from the one perspective that I first mentioned that that will make energy and comfort more affordable to people who don't have it today.
Thank you.
Does anybody want to have the last question?
Yeah, we need a great battery.
Well, I'd just like to thank you for holding for 40 minutes on the subject and then sustaining this discussion. I think you can see how we wanted to question you, put different views, and so I think it was absolutely fantastic. So I'd like to put our hands together for that.